History as it happens, April 11th, 2023. Pardon me, Mr. President.
5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic...
I had no prior knowledge of the Watergate break-in.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour
granted
in this office.
And by these presents do grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
Ford's pardon of Nixon stopped what might have been the first indictment of a former U.S. president. It took another half-century for history to be made with the charges against Donald Trump for allegedly falsifying business records, a case that is by no means a slam dunk. When it comes to prosecuting presidents, there's a reason why there were no precedents. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
First former president in U.S. history to face criminal charges. This, of course, is unprecedented.
This unprecedented case against Trump will have...
The only crime that I have committed is to fearlessly defend our nation from those who seek to destroy it.
Well, I think it's very difficult for Ford to have projected himself forward what is now almost 50 years later and try to predict what would be the consequence of this action 50 years later. And he was thinking of the political situation back in 1974 rather. You know, he felt that this was the only way of healing the political wounds in America and avoiding a political civil war in the country.
August 8th, 1974. Richard Nixon surrenders.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
After 2 wrenching years trying to cover up his crimes in the Watergate scandal, Nixon faced a certain impeachment in the House and likely conviction in the Senate. So he finally put the country before himself.
America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress.
Just 1 month later, September 8th, 1974, Nixon and the entire nation he once led learned there would be no legal consequences for his malfeasance.
Finally, I feel that Richard Nixon and his loved ones have suffered enough and will continue to suffer no matter what I do, no matter what we, as a great and good nation, can do together to make his goal of peace come true.
In a nationally televised address, President Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon because he was concerned about the former president's anguish and whether he'd ever receive a fair trial. But most of all, Ford wanted to put the nightmare in the past, to move on from the endless bitterness and division.
There are no historic or legal precedents to which I can turn in this matter, none that precisely fit the circumstances of a private citizen who has resigned the presidency of the United States.
Whether Richard Nixon would have been prosecuted by the special counsel Leon Jaworski is unclear. But we can say for certain today the pardon prevented the country from establishing any legal precedent for dealing with a rogue president. That is not the case in South Korea, to name one country. The Washington Times' Andrew Salmon writes from Seoul that South Korea's former leaders have routinely been jailed, sentenced to death, and even committed suicide amid judicial probes after leaving office. You can find his article at WashingtonTimes.com. In the United States, governors, mayors, members of Congress have been prosecuted and convicted of corruption. Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, pleaded nolo contendere. That's when you accept a conviction as though a guilty plea had been entered, to a felony corruption charge, and he resigned in October 1973 in the midst of Watergate. But no American president has ever been indicted, let alone convicted, until Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg got a grand jury to indict Donald Trump on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, a move, even if legally justified, that is sure to further inflame partisan hatreds while providing the former president with ammunition for his campaign.
And now this massive election interference at a scale never seen before in our country, beginning with the radical left, George Soros-backed prosecutor Alvin Bragg of New York, who campaigned on the fact that he would get President Trump. I'm going to get him. I'm going to get him. This is a guy campaigning.
Trump does face possible indictment in 3 more cases: his handling of classified documents, his attempts to overturn the 2020 election in Georgia, and for his role in inciting the January 6th riot. Yet he remains the most popular Republican politician in the country. And that is just one of many differences between now and Watergate, because Nixon became a pariah in the Republican Party, really in the country. So maybe Watergate isn't very helpful as a parallel to the problem of Donald Trump. It was a different time, different media environment, and Trump is a different personality. Historian Michael Dobbs is the author of King Richard, Nixon, and Watergate, An American Tragedy. Michael Dobbs, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much. It's good to be here.
So, Michael, this is what you get for writing a book about Nixon and Watergate. People like me seek you out over and over again to try to help us understand what is happening today with Donald Trump and other matters. I'm on a mission, doomed to fail, as I say to everyone, to convince people to stop using the word unprecedented when discussing American politics, because few things are truly unprecedented. You know this as a historian. Although I guess we should concede that it was unprecedented to see a former president sitting in a courtroom facing criminal charges, felonies that could put him in prison if the prosecution wins a conviction. Before I drill down here and start addressing comparisons or parallels to Watergate, what did you think of that when you saw those photos of Trump sitting in the courtroom?
Well, as you say, it was unprecedented. Yeah, it's sort of humbling for a former president to be sitting not in the dock, but at a table surrounded by his lawyers and with the Secret Service well back and the security in the courtroom being supplied not by the Secret Service, but by the courtroom personnel. You know, we haven't seen that in America. Yeah, that was quite an image.
It made it real for me, not to sound like a hippie, but, Trump has dominated our politics for so long, and there have been people on the left who despise him, wanted to see him walked out of the White House in handcuffs the first day he took office, right? And there's been so much talk, and, this will be the time they finally get him, and this is it. Republicans will finally give up on him. But to see him there sitting in court, that did make it real for me. And whether you hate Trump, love Trump, indifferent to Trump, although there are very few people who are indifferent to him, it really spoke to how serious this is. Wouldn't you say this is a problem in American politics? We have trouble holding our presidents accountable. Lesser political figures such as Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, basically pled guilty to a felony. He was indicted. Here in D.C., former Mayor Marion Barry, the late Marion Barry, was charged with a crime. But when it comes to the president, it is a difficult call, legally and politically, on what to do about alleged wrongdoing.
Right. Well, I think there are probably 2 things here. One is that Americans do have, or did have, a basic respect for the presidency, whether the president was of your own party or the opposite party. And there's still the idea that he was your president. And that is sort of gradually been undermined over the last 20, 30 years, perhaps partly because of Watergate itself. But then there is the question of Trump's character. And I do think that Trump is a break with former presidents, Nixon included, and has been willing to, and even welcomed, various sort of situations being provocative in a way that no former president, including Nixon, would have behaved in that kind of way. Trump has pushed out the boundaries of behavior by a president. That is part of the reason why he's in legal trouble now, not just with this case, but with several others.
Trump seems to revel in the attention.
Yeah, Nixon essentially, Nixon broke the law. He can credibly be accused of breaking the law. He committed obstruction of justice. But basically, he respected the system. He did not try to contest an election. And when it came to his own impeachment and removal from office, of course, he was extremely unhappy about it. But he did not go out kicking and screaming. He went out in a dignified way, lifting off from the south lawn of the White House in a helicopter, with a dignified farewell ceremony. Trump didn't leave the White House in the same manner.
Trump called the prosecutors in New York human scum. Nixon never really participated in that kind of thing.
Well, he might well have called people scum in private in these private conversations, but he didn't do it in public. Of course, there was no Twitter back then. I mean, I think the better comparison with Trump is actually the 1960 election, when Nixon had much more justification than Trump ever had to challenge the result of that election. It was a few thousand votes in Texas and in Illinois, and some of those votes were questionable. Nixon could have legitimately contested that election, but he didn't. Of course, he bore a grudge against the Kennedys, who he considered had robbed him of victory. It was a private grudge, and that can partly explain what happened with Watergate, but he never contested an election publicly.
So what do you think of the very premise of this conversation, this episode, that we look to Watergate for help, for parallels, for comparisons, for differences? Maybe Watergate isn't all that helpful trying to figure out what lies ahead with Trump.
Well, I think in general with history, we can draw lessons from history. We can see parallels. But, every situation is different. There's some things that Watergate has in common with more recent scandals, and in some ways in which Watergate is completely unique.
Well, here's one useful parallel, I think, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it. This is about the institution, the office of the presidency. I mean, Trump's a former president, but he's running for office again, and he might win the nomination for the GOP. I mean, wouldn't you agree that this isn't just about the individual here, or even the crimes they're accused of committing? This is about the institution of the presidency.
Well, if the man is the president, then anything he does affects the institution of the presidency. And basically, I think that Nixon played by the rules, ultimately. He was unhappy with the rules, and he complained about the rules, and he certainly tried to bend the rules. But in the end, he respected the rules. And when it became clear that, there was a majority in Congress that would have voted for his impeachment and trial, he left. That didn't apply to Trump. Trump rejects the rules. So he's sort of outside the bounds of what we consider, or what most people, I think, consider normal behavior as president. Whereas I think ultimately Nixon was inside those bounds.
Some folks listening to this will say, what do you mean, Michael Dobbs? Nixon played by the rules. I mean, he obstructed justice. He broke the law. What do you mean by that?
When it came down to it, he left office. In fact, he became the first president to leave office because the system worked. When it became obvious that he had attempted to obstruct justice, a legal term for a cover-up, and it became obvious that the Congress would impeach him and convict him, then he understood that the game was up and he left office. I mean that he saw the system actually worked and he permitted the system to work. What happened on January the 6th was something entirely different. Trump rejected the basic rules of the system, which is if you lose an election, you concede gracefully to the other guy and promise to work for a peaceful transition. Trump rejected that. And I think there's a distinction between that kind of behavior and Nixon's rule breaking. Of course, Nixon broke the rules. I mean, other presidents have broken the rules as well, to a lesser or greater degree, but they've all respected the institution of the presidency and its place in American life and the most important rules of the game, which is that if you lose an election, you recognize the result of that election and leave in a peaceful, respectful manner.
As we look to the future, the first essential is to begin healing the wounds of this nation, to put the bitterness and divisions of the recent past behind us, and to rediscover those shared ideals that lie at the heart of our strength and unity as a great and as a free people.
Some have said that had Ford not pardoned Nixon, we today might have some precedent on how to, well, charge a current or former president. Whatever one thinks of the idea or the rule, unwritten rule that you can't, or maybe it is a written rule at the Justice Department that you can't indict a sitting president. Here's the premise, Michael Dobbs, that by pardoning Nixon, Ford made a mistake, not just in the case of Nixon, but for posterity, that we don't know how to deal with this problem today.
Well, I think it's very difficult for Ford to have projected himself forward, what is now almost 50 years later, and try to predict what would be the consequence of this action 50 years later. I mean, he was thinking of the political situation back in 1974 rather. He felt that this was the only way of healing the political wounds in America and avoiding a political civil war in the country. At the time, most Americans didn't agree with him, actually, in the heat of the moment. But over the years, most Americans came round to the view that he acted correctly and in the interests of the country. Opinion polls showed a shift in public opinion on that. What would be our opinion today? I don't think a poll has been taken recently.
Yeah.
But the situation is so different today in 2023 than it is back in 1974. I think it's very difficult to say what would have happened had Nixon been put on trial. There's so many variables involved.
The independent counsel at that time was Leon Jaworski, because Nixon had fired the previous one, Archibald Cox. What was Jaworski planning to do against Nixon at the time of the pardon? Was he ramping up, potentially charging Nixon?
Yeah, they haven't studied that particular episode in any detail at all. So they were moving forward with prosecuting many of the people around Nixon who ended up being sent to prison, including former Attorney General John Mitchell, Nixon's chief of staff, Haldeman.
One wonders what that might have looked like, right? First of all, how would Richard Nixon have gotten a fair trial? Where would they have found the jury, right, that wasn't biased one way or the other? I mean, there were some practical considerations there as well.
After years of bitter controversy and divisive national debate, I have been advised, and I am compelled to conclude, that many months and perhaps more years will have to pass before Richard Nixon could obtain a fair trial by jury in any jurisdiction of the United States under governing decisions of the Supreme Court.
Well, you could say the same with Trump. I mean, it's very difficult to recruit a completely impartial jury.
Especially in New York.
In the case of Trump.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, well, Trump wants to relocate the trial out to Staten Island, where he would certainly be able to find a few jurors who'd vote against conviction, I imagine.
Well, I'm always armed with a book when I do these interviews. Here is The Age of Reagan by Sean Wilentz, page 30. Neither the Watergate special prosecutor Leon Jaworski nor the federal judge who had overseen the final phases of President Nixon's agony, John J. Sirica, showed any zeal to press charges against him as a private citizen. And Wilentz concludes that Ford's pardon did have noble motives, that it wasn't a corrupt deal, leave office, Richard, and I will pardon you, or anything like that. But he didn't seem, Ford that is, did not seem to handle the pardon very well. He didn't prepare the American people for it when he knew public opinion at that time favored prosecuting Nixon.
Yeah, I certainly give the benefit of the doubt to Ford. I think he acted in what he thought was the national interest in pardoning Nixon, that they hadn't done a deal beforehand, although perhaps Nixon could imagine that he would receive a pardon. You could say it was a sort of communications problem. I mean, I think it's very difficult to sort of communicate in a different way. I mean, Ford went on TV and explained his reasons. Perhaps he should have prepared it better. He paid a political price for it. I mean, he might well have been elected president in his own right had it not been for that decision.
He was concerned about Nixon himself, who was really struggling in his seclusion in California at the time. The pardon, for those who don't know, came just 1 month after Nixon resigned, August 8th, September 8th. But Ford and the evidence about what he was thinking privately does square with what he said publicly in that televised speech. Ford was also worried about the country, wanted to put this nightmare, as he called it, behind them. Now, it didn't work that way. It was one of those situations where whatever he did, and he acknowledged this as well, it was going to linger for a while. But he reasoned that leaving open the possibility that Nixon would be prosecuted, go on trial, maybe even imprisoned, would just overshadow everything that he was trying to do as the new president. Do you see it that way as well?
Right. He coined this phrase, the long national nightmare, which he said was over. It wasn't over completely, but it was sort of suspended for a little bit. I think in the short term, at least, it was the right decision, that it would have just extended the divisions of the 60s into the early 70s. And, the country had to get on and think about other things.
Contrary to today, where, unlike Nixon, Trump is not in disgrace among Republican voters. How do you explain that difference? Smoking guns aren't what they used to be.
Well, I explain it partly by the country has changed. I mean, there was some degree of bipartisanship still in the 70s, the early 70s. I mean, after all, there were a lot of Republican senators who were on the Watergate committee, and they sort of pushed forward with the investigation in a way completely different to what we saw with some of the impeachment investigations of Trump. So, that degree of bipartisanship, which was already coming under strain in the 70s, has disappeared completely now. I mean, that doesn't exist anymore. And partly Trump himself is a different political animal to Nixon and is willing to take his grudge matches, much further than Nixon ever was, and never gives up. He still has a core support, particularly within the Republican Party. Public opinion polls show that he has, around 40% of the electorate. Whether he has enough to be elected president again, we'll see over the next couple of years. But he certainly has enough support to get the Republican nomination.
Smoking guns, not what they used to be. Do you want to address that one? We have it on tape, Donald Trump calling the Secretary of State in Georgia.
I just want to find 11,780 votes. So tell me, Brad, what are we going to do? We won the election, and it's not fair to take it away from us like this. And it's going to be very costly in many ways, and I think you have to say that you're going to re-examine it.
We have to stand by our numbers. We believe our numbers are right.
But it didn't seem to make enough of an impact.
I mean, I would certainly call that a smoking gun, and a lot of other people would consider it a smoking gun. I mean, when it comes to trial, it will be interesting to know whether a jury in Georgia considers that to be a smoking gun. The defense will claim, well, it was sort of hypothetical. He was not sort of saying, switch 11,000 votes to my side. He was just kind of raising a hypothetical possibility.
Suggesting it, right? And that's if he is indicted in that case.
Friendly suggestion, yes.
Yeah. He hasn't been indicted in that case yet, and he faces charges in multiple other cases. I guess this is a media issue then. I mean, there was no Fox News around during Nixon's time that could say, these tapes that just came out, Cronkite might be saying, that's it for Nixon, it is over, but that's fake news. Get the truth from us.
Had Trump been back in the White House then, I guess he would have tried to brazen it out and say, yep, I said this, but he would have sort of invented some excuse as to why this was not obstruction of justice. But that didn't occur to Nixon. So that's why I'm trying to argue that the two personalities are very different. And, Nixon ultimately, when he was confronted with that evidence, he agreed that, he had to go. He understood that.
Yeah. So it's been said that no one is above the law. But in the case of the hush money payment to Stormy Daniels and Alvin Bragg's case against Trump, my view is if you're going to go after someone like Donald Trump, you have to have a really good case. Because one, I think, reasonable observation about all of this is these cases are divisive. Maybe Mr. Bragg wants to look at this as strictly a legal matter, but it's not strictly a legal matter. I mean, how do you strike a balance there between doing what's right legally and also taking into account the politics here? This is going to be very divisive and drive our country further apart.
Right. Legally, it rests on an untried theory that there's the falsifying of business records. I think it's pretty obvious that that occurred. but that would only be a misdemeanor in a New York court. So you have to have some underlying crime. As I understand it, it's very difficult to prove that underlying crime, at least in the New York state context.
Well, Bragg didn't even mention it, though.
And one would certainly hope for a stronger legal case if you're going to try to convict a former president. It reminds me a little bit of the Clinton impeachment. The basic underlying crime here is that he had sex with somebody else and then he wanted to hush that up, which is sort of very similar or very reminiscent of Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, which ultimately, the attempt to impeach Clinton over the Monica Lewinsky scandal didn't really hold up in the court of public opinion.
That's right.
This could be similar in the case of Trump and the Stormy Daniels affair. As you say, if you're going to go after a president or a former president, it better be over a pretty serious issue. Sex is probably not the issue to choose.
There was a backlash when Nixon was in trouble too, right, among his hardline supporters. Ultimately, they were in the minority. Most of the country came around to the position that Nixon had to go.
Well, Nixon had a sort of core of support within the Republican Party who, felt that he should go all the way. But it certainly wasn't as strong as the core that Trump can rest on.
Absolutely.
So I think by the time of Nixon's resignation, the mainstream of Republican voters recognized that this was the only way out.
Is impeachment broken? It's my view that Trump is ultimately not a legal problem. He is a political problem and therefore can be dealt with politically, i.e. voters voting him out of office in 2020. Yeah. He responded to that by egging on a mob to attack Congress. The other available political tool is impeachment, and that doesn't seem to be very effective. It's probably been abused as well.
Well, there must be some way of getting rid of a president for huge crimes. So if you got rid of impeachment altogether, how do you then get rid of a president who has committed high crimes and misdemeanors while in office and still has 2 or 3 years of his term to run? But I agree with you that using the impeachment weapon against more minor crimes is opening the Pandora's box.
Maybe I wasn't clear. I'm not in favor of getting rid of impeachment, but no president's ever been convicted. Andrew Johnson was the closest in the 1860s after Lincoln's assassination. And in today's media environment and partisan environment, you ask me, how do you get rid of a president who's committed obvious high crimes and misdemeanors, however that is defined? It's pretty vague in the Constitution. I really don't think it's ever going to happen. And I hope it doesn't have to ever happen. I don't really want to see this happen. But it seems that impeachment is not a very effective tool, at least historically speaking.
Well, I think the lessons of all these impeachments is that for impeachment to succeed, you need some degree of bipartisanship. It can't be a partisan impeachment. So you have to have what happened in 1974, that the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress, but in order to move forward, they had to persuade a significant number of Republicans to go along with them. Impeachment just based on one party, the opposition party, is never going to achieve its desired result.
I think ultimately it's still a political problem, not a legal one. And that would be Republicans rejecting Donald Trump's bid for the nomination in 2024. But he's obviously the most popular Republican candidate or politician in the country, despite everything that's happened. Final question, Michael Dobbs, is what is one aspect or two aspects, however many you'd like to name, of Watergate that people don't get right when they bring it up in this context?
That's an interesting question. I haven't thought a lot about that, but...
Well, mine is how long Watergate took. I think people forget how long it all took to be resolved.
Right. That's true. Actually, that occurred to me during the impeachment of Trump, the first impeachment, when the Democrats tried to rush that through Congress in a few months. If we look at the investigation of Nixon, it took 2 years from the formation of those first committees in Congress to accumulate all the evidence, both in the House and the Senate. And there's volumes upon volumes of evidence that was collected and published. And the whole process took 2 years. And that was completely different from either of the Trump impeachments, in which the whole process was reduced to a few weeks or a couple of months. The investigation of Nixon was extremely thorough and took that political drama lasted for a couple of years. You may question whether you should use the impeachment weapon at all, but you certainly cannot do it in a rushed manner.
Well, when Nixon first started getting in trouble, the I word wasn't immediately raised. It took some time to dust impeachment off. It hadn't been used since Andrew Johnson's presidency. Today, people say impeachment, and then they do the investigation. And as you pointed out, the investigations of Trump, I mean, the second one, I can understand why that one took place quickly, but the first one was fairly rushed. It did happen quickly. And I think that erodes public confidence in the process. And I don't defend Trump here on my podcast. I also don't go out of my way to attack him. I try to talk about other things. But I do care about due process.
I think that is one of the lessons of Watergate, and one that we tend to forget is that this took a long time and involved armies of prosecutors and armies of lawyers collecting evidence, and all that evidence was produced, and that was crucial in obtaining this sort of bipartisan, what ended up as a bipartisan judgment that Nixon had to go. So that preparatory work was not done in the case of Trump, neither the political preparatory work nor the legal investigative preparatory work.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, there was the Cold War and then the global war on terrorism. But between those two massive conflicts was the 1990s. We're going to revisit U.S. foreign policy during that decade, a decade of drift. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.